Every empire swears its money is safe. Every government insists collapse is impossible. And every generation trusts that their savings will last. But history tells a crueler story. Money always fails. From the silver coins of Rome to the paper notes of the French Revolution, from the marks of Weimar Germany to the locked bank accounts of modern Lebanon, the pattern repeats. The collapse of money is not an accident. It is the rule. And when it happens, most people are destroyed. Their wages buy less, their savings vanish, their pensions evaporate, their lives are gutted by promises that no longer mean anything. But not everyone is destroyed. Some survive, some even thrive. And if you look carefully at history, you will see that the survivors are not the ones who trusted most. They are the ones who doubted first. They are the ones who held what could not be printed away, who owned what governments could not counterfeit, who possessed the skills and assets that remained valuable when money itself turned to dust. This is the brutal truth hidden in the ruins of every financial collapse. Paper dies, but real value endures. So what survives? That is the question this story will answer. We'll trace the collapse of currencies across 1,000 years, from Byzantium to Solidus to the bread riots of revolutionary France, from the Black Death to the Asian financial crisis. We'll see how banks, governments, and empires played the same game over and over, promising stability, then delivering ruin. And more importantly, we'll see what outlasted the ruin. Because in every collapse, something does. When the Byzantine Empire debased its gold coin, merchants who had hoarded real metal survived. When plague swept Europe and half the population vanished, laborers with skills suddenly commanded fortunes. When French paper promises dissolved into riots, those who held land and food could not be cheated. When banks in Lebanon locked their doors, those with cash abroad or assets outside the system still had options. History is merciless, but it is also consistent. It shows us that survival is not random. It is patterned, it is predictable, and it is brutally simple. Trust dies, paper fails, but value, in land, in skills, in resources, in production, survives. The collapse of money is not some distant nightmare. It has already happened dozens of times, in dozens of ways. It will happen again. The question is not whether collapse comes. The question is whether you will be left holding worthless promises or something real. Welcome to Ledger of Power. This is not financial advice, it is financial education through the lens of history. And today, we uncover what really survives. When money fails, the Byzantine Empire is often remembered as the eastern half of Rome that somehow survived 1,000 years after the Western Empire crumbled. And at the heart of its survival was a single coin, the gold solidus. For centuries, the solidus was trusted across continents. Merchants from the Middle East, from Asia, even from Europe accepted it without hesitation. It was the closest thing the medieval world had to a global reserve currency. Why? Because it was consistent. Pure gold, reliable weight. A promise that felt unbreakable. But history has no unbreakable promises. By the 11th century, Byzantine rulers faced rising military costs, political chaos, and shrinking revenues. They turned to the same trick Rome had used centuries before, debasement. The solidus, once nearly pure, was slowly mixed with cheaper alloys. At first, no one noticed. Then, merchants began to question its color, its weight, its feel. The coin that had anchored Mediterranean trade became just another piece of political fiction. And when the trust collapsed, so did the currency. Trade slowed, inflation rose, the empire's financial backbone snapped. But here is just the lesson. What survived was deemed to the paper promises or the official decrees. What survived was what could not be faked. Merchants who had quietly hoarded real gold, silver, or land preserved their wealth. Those who trusted the government's coin lost everything. The collapse of the solidus teaches us the first great rule of survival. When governments dilute money, real value flees to assets they cannot counterfeit. But not every collapse comes from rulers debasing coins. Sometimes collapse comes from forces that no emperor, no king, no banker can control. In the mid-14th century, Europe faced the most devastating pandemic in its history, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, as many as half of all Europeans died. Cities emptied, villages vanished. Trade routes broke down. At first, this looked like total catastrophe, an economic implosion, and for many families it was. Generations were wiped out. Shops closed, fields went untended. But the economic story of the plague was more complex than simple ruin. Because when half the labor force disappears, labor becomes precious. Survivors could suddenly demand higher wages. Food and land, once scarce, became abundant compared to people. Families with liquidity, with silver, with goods, or simply with the ability to work, found themselves in a buyer's market. Land that had cost fortunes before the plague could be bought for a fraction. Abandoned houses, deserted farms, and vacant workshops became opportunities for the living. This is the second rule of survival. Collapse reshuffles the deck. Wealth doesn't vanish. It changes hands. The people who survive are those with reserves, not necessarily the richest, but those with something to trade when others cannot. Liquidity is power, skills are leverage, and scarcity can flip in an instant. The Black Death survivors show us that even when money itself loses meaning, value persists in what people still need: food, shelter, work, production. Collapse destroyed millions, but for the few who had resources and resilience, it became a grim ladder upward. When we think of the Renaissance, we think of beauty, art, architecture. Florence, rising as the jewel of Europe. But behind the cathedrals and paintings was something else: banking. Florence, in the 14th century, was the financial capital of Europe. Families like the Bardi and the Peruzzi dominated trade and credit, their banks so powerful that kings and popes relied on them, and that was their undoing. In the 1340s, the King of England, Edward III, borrowed enormous sums from Florence to fund his war against France. He promised repayment, secured with the faith and reputation of the crown. But when the war dragged on, the money ran out and Edward defaulted. Overnight, Florence's mighty banks collapsed. Depositors were ruined. Trade froze, and a city that had seemed untouchable was thrown into turmoil. Ordinary citizens discovered a bitter truth that echoes through every century. Size is not safety. Too big to fail is a lie as old as finance itself. What survived? Not the promises of bankers, not the prestige of institutions. What survived were the merchants who had diversified, the families who kept tangible wealth outside the reach of financial dynasties. The lesson is clear. No institution is immortal. Your savings are only safe until the day the institution decides otherwise. Fast forward 4 centuries, and the story plays out again in revolutionary France. In the 1790s, as the French monarchy collapsed and revolutionaries seized church lands, a new paper currency was born, the assignats. Backed in theory by confiscated property, the assignats were supposed to stabilize the economy. They were patriotic, modern, rational, but governments cannot resist the temptation to print. And the revolutionaries, desperate for funds, printed assignats with abandon. Each new issue diluted the last, prices soared, wages lagged, and soon the assignat was worthless. Farmers refused to sell food for paper. Markets collapsed. Bread riots swept Paris. And the revolution, already unstable, devoured itself. The lesson? The winners in this collapse weren't the ones holding patriotic promises. They were the ones who held food, gold, or property, the assets that governments cannot conjure from thin air. For the ordinary Parisian, the lesson came too late. Paper money is only as strong as the trust behind it, and once that trust breaks, your savings don't just shrink, they vanish. Florence and France remind us of 2 brutal truths of collapse. First, that no institution is too powerful to fail. And second, that paper promises are the most fragile currency of all. The American Civil War is remembered for its battlefields, its politics, and the fight over slavery. But behind the cannon, smoke was another war, a financial one. Both the Union and the Confederacy discovered the same reality. Modern wars cost more than any treasury can bear, and so both turned to paper. In the North, the government issued greenbacks, money not backed by gold, but by the full faith of the United States. At first, it seemed bold, patriotic, ingenious. But as the presses ran hot, the value of each greenback fell. Inflation eroded trust. The money that had once been worth a full dollar in gold fell to half that, then less. In the South, the problem was even worse. The Confederacy printed graybacks in staggering quantities. By the war's end, Confederate inflation had reached almost unimaginable levels. Prices rose by thousands of percent. A soldier's paycheck could barely buy a loaf of bread. Families carried bags of paper that dissolved in value before they could spend it. What survived? Not the salaries, not the patriotic graybacks. What survived was hard value: land, food, gold, goods that could not be conjured from a printing press. Ordinary Southerners were devastated. Lifelong savings evaporated into dust. And yet, opportunists with access to real goods emerged with fortunes. The cruel truth was laid bare. When paper dies, real assets live. But collapse is not always born of war. Sometimes it comes from the invisible hands of speculation, debt, and trust itself. In 1997, Southeast Asia was booming. Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and South Korea had attracted global capital, borrowed heavily in US dollars, and built an economic miracle. Investors poured in, believing the growth story would never end. Then, in July, the Thai baht collapsed. What began as a speculative attack spiraled into a regional contagion. Suddenly, debts denominated in foreign currency were impossible to pay. Dollars owed became mountains too steep to climb. The collapse spread like fire. Currencies across the region plunged. Economies shrank. Businesses shuttered. Millions lost jobs. Who survived? Not the governments with their dollar debts, not the corporations tied to foreign credit, The survivors were those who held dollars abroad, those with liquidity outside their collapsing currency. For ordinary citizens, the suffering was immense. Savings wiped out, mortgages doubled in cost, wages gone overnight. And yet, behind the suffering was a familiar transfer of wealth. Hedge funds and Wall Street giants swooped in, buying Asian assets at fire sale prices. Nations were forced to beg the International Monetary Fund for bailouts that came with harsh conditions, forcing austerity on citizens while opening doors for foreign capital to profit. The lesson is brutal, but timeless. Debt in someone else's money is a death trap. When the storm hits, it isn't the creditor who drowns, it's the debtor. From the battlefields of America to the skyscrapers of Bangkok, the rhyme is the same. Paper collapses, debt crushes, and survival belongs not to the loyal, but to the prepared. In 2019, the people of Lebanon woke up to discover the unthinkable. Banks, the very institutions that had promised to guard their wealth, locked their doors. Withdrawals were frozen, deposits were trapped. The Lebanese pound collapsed, losing more than 90% of its value. A lifetime of savings was reduced to pocket change. Doctors, engineers, teachers, retirees, ordinary hardworking people lined up outside the marble facades of their banks, begging for access to their own money. But the truth was undeniable. It was gone. And once again, survival belonged not to the faithful, but to the wary. Those who had diversified abroad, who held gold or property, who kept cash outside the banking system, they preserved something. Everyone else was crushed. If this feels distant, it shouldn't. In 2008, Americans watched their homes repossessed and their pensions decimated, while the very banks that caused the crisis were bailed out. In 2020, trillions were printed to keep the system alive. Lifelines that inflated asset prices for the wealthy while leaving ordinary wages stagnant. In 2023, regional U.S. banks collapsed almost overnight when depositors lost confidence, proving once again that too big to fail is a fairy tale we tell ourselves until the door slams shut. History's rhyme is clear. Trust is fragile, and paper promises are the weakest foundation of all. So what really survives every time money collapses? In Byzantium, it was gold. After the Black Death, it was liquidity to buy abandoned land. In Florence, it was diversification outside the banks. In the Confederacy, it was food and hard goods. In revolutionary France, it was property the government couldn't print. In Asia, it was avoiding debt in foreign currency. In Lebanon, it was getting out before the freeze. The details change. The lesson does not. Real wealth is never in paper. It is in what governments cannot counterfeit: tangible assets, liquidity, and skills. The baker who could still make bread, the farmer who could still feed his neighbors, the craftsman who could still repair tools. These people didn't just survive collapse, they rose in it. Every collapse is a transfer, from the many who trusted to the few who prepared, from paper promises to tangible value, from passive savers to active builders. And here is the paradox. Collapse is both tragedy and opportunity. For the unprepared, it is ruin. For the ready, it is the greatest redistribution of wealth in history. After the Black Death, peasants became landowners. After 2008, those with cash bought homes at foreclosure prices. The next collapse will be no different. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And if you refuse to listen, it will rhyme right over you. So ask yourself, when the next collapse comes, when it will you be left holding promises or holding something real? If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.